All right, golfers, I want to talk about this famous concept or phrase that we say a lot in golf, which is club face is king. You hear a lot of coaches saying that the club face is the most important element of the golf swing. And I certainly am one of those coaches who agrees with this statement for a wide variety of reasons. I'm going to go over a few of them. A lot of the bad issues that players develop in their game, in their mechanics, let's say specifically, is directly related to the club face and our intent of where we're trying to hit the ball. At the end of the day, you see a lot of these golfers saying, like, how come I can make such a good practice swing and then I stand over the ball, my swing changes? Well, it's because all of a sudden the ball on the ground actually has a certain intent of where it's trying to go. When there's no golf ball on the ground, there's no intent behind the practice swing. So you can have a variable that's out of position and it won't matter. And that variable oftentimes is the club face. So, you see golfers take a practice swing where it's like their club face, they don't realize it is wide open in their swing, right? And they can make this like really nice looking practice swing and they finish in their position and everything looks really clean. And then they get over the ball and it's like their body stops and they flip or they early release or they do something and they're like, how come I'm not doing that on the practice swing? Well, because on the practice swing, when the ball is no longer on the floor, all of a sudden that open club face doesn't mean anything anymore because it doesn't matter if the club face comes in wide open on the practice swing because there's no golf ball actually taking off. Whereas when you're actually trying to hit a ball to a specific target, your brain plays a lot in what's happening subconsciously. And so because you have an intent of where you're trying to get the ball to go, your body's going to adapt and do things to try to get that ball there. And oftentimes that comes in the mechanics that you see at the bottom where you're compensating and stalling and flipping and so on. So if the club face is open, what kind of compensations are we going to see from that kind of issue, right? There's a whole wide range of them. As a starting point, when the face angle is open, if you come into the golf ball with a pretty good path, right? Let's say you have a shallow club and your club face is open. Well, if you don't flip at this and the face angle stays open, you're just going to hit a big block. So my face angle is going to point to the right for the right-handed player. That ball is going to take off way right. It's not a very functional ball flight, right? It's not pretty to stand there and try to hit a shot to this target and seeing the ball come out there and not coming back. So obviously, all of a sudden, that's not functional. So what happens? Your body has to adapt to that, right? So we start to create compensations to match the club face. So all of a sudden, the club face is dictating what my body has to do now in order to hit the ball to my target. So face angle comes in wide open. And now, even if I'm in a shallow position, I might stall my body to give the hands time to square up the face. And oftentimes that comes in the form of an early release. So face angle gets open. And what happens is, I can't create any sort of shaft lean because my face angle is going to stay wide open, right? Because shaft lean as a variable, I've spoken about this before, tends to actually directionally open the club face a little bit. So if my face angle is a little bit open, well, I can no longer compress the ball with shaft lean or the ball's going to point even more open, or the face angle, I should say, doesn't work. So what ends up happening from there? Well, then sometimes golfers automatically start to jump up, stall the body, and throw the wrists at the ball to try to find a way to square the face. My face angle actually looks close here, doesn't it? But it's only close because I big time early released the club. So what ended up happening is now in this first scenario here, you start to see an early release pattern develop and you start to see the body stall in order to give the hands time to square the face up because the face angle is wide open. So now my body has had to sacrifice its pivot, the way it tilts and turns and all that, in an effort to correct the face angle. So club face was dictating what my body had to do there. Already, that's a big problem. A second thing that you'll see oftentimes with players is they start to develop really aggressive path issues in an attempt to try to square the club face up. Meaning, if my club face is open, like I just said, I can't swing from the inside, right? Unless I release the hands earlier or if I flip my arms over really aggressively and I roll my forearms, way too much through impact to try to square the face up. So unless you want to do some sort of compensation like that at impact, what we start to see with a lot of high handicap players especially is they start to develop really bad shaft movement and path issues to match the club face. So their club face was wide open, and whether it's because of a lack of knowledge or whether it's because of bad information or whatever the case may be, we don't need to divulge that kind of information. Let's just say they didn't have the know-how of what's going on. So the club face was open. They didn't notice it or they didn't try to correct it. And what you start to see with players is they kept the club face open, but now they're steepening the club and cutting across the ball. If my face angle is open and I swing from the inside, I'm obviously going to hit a huge block. Well, if my face angle is open, right, like you see here, but now I'm going to steepen the club and spin out my chest out of sequence and swing really hard left for the right-handed player, so very out to in on it, I can actually try to find a way to get the club face square. So some golfers don't realize this, But subconsciously, what they're doing is they are losing the structure of the shaft movement and the club path, and all these bad habits they've developed was in an effort to square the fact that the club face was wide open. So again, now you're actually developing poor shaft habits, right, and bad mechanics to match the club face. Once again, club face is king here. So the club face was open, and rather than fixing the root cause of the problem, which was this guy, they started to develop bad habits in other areas. And I see this a lot with players who don't necessarily have that information or knowledge of what's taking place. So they're going to stand there, club face gets wide open, and obviously if my club face stays wide open here and I try to swing from the inside, I'm just going to hit a big block. The ball's going to start way right for me as a right-hander, and it's never going to come back. So what ends up happening from there is instead what they start to do is they try to correct that another way. So club face gets wide open. Well, if I steepen this club, get really over the top of it, right? Even though my club face is open, if I swing hard, to the left for the right-handed player, so I get very over the top of the ball, I'm actually starting the ball left. This was me actually closing the club face, but I'm doing it by really developing a bad habit with my path. So now what ends up happening is I'm starting to develop a really bad habit, a really big issue with the shaft movement, and it was really only taking place, or let's say the starting point of why it took place was because the club face was open. So once again, club face is king here and is dictating a lot of what my body had to do in an effort to try to get the face angle square. Now, the important element, and something that I think a lot of players struggle with, is understanding what to expect as you begin to close the club face. So if you're one of those players who has a club face issue in your golf swing and you're trying to correct it, you need to have the awareness, or if you're working with a coach, the coach should give you the awareness, like I do with my players, of what to expect in the early stages of you trying to work on this. So let's say you were that golfer who stood over the ball, your club face was coming down wide open, and you're that guy who has that big time early release pattern, guy or girl, my apologies, right? And you're that person who had that really big early release pattern to try to find a way to square the club face up. So you added a lot of loft, you're not creating a lot of compression here, right? You don't have any sort of shaft lean because you can't because the club face is open, and you want to try to find a way to improve that whole scenario. Well, as a starting point, in order to make sure that you get shaft lean and compression, which I've spoken about in previous videos, you need to have the club face in a stronger position. So it cannot be wide open coming down. Okay, good. So we have that information and that understanding. Okay, so then the question then becomes, so what do I expect in the early stages of me doing this? Well, in order to get that compression, I need to close the club face. In the early stages of a player who has that early release pattern, if they go from a open club face position to now they've strengthened the club face, whether that's through a stronger grip or through more flexion of the lead wrist, and we've spoken about all these details in other videos you can see on my page or some other coaches, right? If I found a way through some sort of structure change to get the club face in a stronger position, like I said, through the grip, through the wrist angles, or through whatever, well, what happens if now your club face is not as open coming down in the downswing, but you're still early releasing the club? Well, what you're going to start to notice with this is that you're going to hit some really aggressive pulls. So for the right-handed player like me and like many of you, that ball is going to go really far to the left. Now, if you're standing there on the range and you don't have that expectation or that awareness going into this type of adjustment that that's going to be your miss, you're going to be really pissed off because you're going to look at that and you're going to get super discouraged and you're going to say, well, why am I going to work on something that's going to make me miss it even further offline? Well, the reality is what's happening is you're now stuck between two patterns. You had an open club face issue. You were early releasing the club, right? And what ended up happening was sometimes you were hitting it good, sometimes you were probably pulling it, but the ball flight was very high, very spinny. Well, now this golfer, instead of having the open club face, they've now strengthened the club face, right? But they still early release the club. Well, now my club face is going to be very, very closed, right? So if I'm somebody who had the open face and I early release it, I can square the face up, but I'll be adding loft and creating problems. Sometimes I'll pull it, sometimes I won't. But if I now want to create more compression, more shaft lean, stronger ball speed and ball flight and all that, and instead of having this open club face, I have strengthened this club face, but now I'm still early releasing the club. Well, in the early stages of this, that club face is going to be pointing super close. So my pulls are actually going to get worse. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You need to have that awareness going into that type of change that's what you have to expect. What's going to happen from there is then, in order to get rid of those pulls, then you start to develop more shaft lean, whether that's through body rotation or a whole bunch of other scenarios to get there. But once you create that shaft lean is going to prevent the club face from pointing too far left for the right-handed golfer, too closed, and you'll start to hit it, obviously, with a stronger flight, more speed, and so on, and you won't pull it as much. But in the early stages of you making that type of change to the club face, your pulls might get worse. You need to have that expectation going into it. So again, club face is king. In order for you to be able to make changes to how the body is moving through the golf ball, you need to make sure that your club face is not in such an open position. And again, that's the same with scenario 2 that I spoke about with the path issues. If you have an over the top path issue, right? And obviously you're cutting across the ball in an effort to try to get the ball started on line because the club face was open, you develop bad habits doing that. Well, if you try to swing more from the inside, but the club face is still open, right? So you're trying to shallow the club and you're trying to do all these things, you're just going to hit a lot of blocks. Now, if you don't mind the blocks, you can make that type of adjustment and then strengthen the club face to prevent that from happening. Or what you can do is you can strengthen the club face first. You're probably still going to be over the top, steep, and all these bad habits, but you'll pull it, right? So all of a sudden, now the club face is in a stronger position, but you're still back to the pulls because instead of the club face being here, it's now more closed, but your body is still reacting as if it was open and still getting steep with the shaft and all that to try to get the ball started on line. But obviously, there's no longer a necessity to do that, but your body's still reacting as if that necessity exists. So I hope that makes sense. So the whole point of this video was just to kind of give you guys the information of saying, look, the club face is going to dictate a lot of what your body and the shaft have to do through the golf ball in the downswing and transition and through impact in order to get the ball to your intended target. At the end of the day, it's all about that. That's why, like I said at the start of this video, what a practice swing, it doesn't matter. It's because there's no intended target. There's no golf ball. Your body doesn't have to adapt to the variables that are out of position. But once the ball's on the floor and you have a target, it does. That's why your swing changes. So when you're making these types of changes, first of all, make sure in your golf swing that your club face is not in a wide open position. This is super important for every player, especially the high handicapper who suffers from slices for the most part. Get that club face in a stronger position, either strengthen your grip, or get the wrist on the glove hand. So that would be the lead wrist. So left hand for the right-handed player into more of a bowed or flex position to strengthen that club face, right? Once you do that, have some expectation of where the golf ball is likely to go when you're in between the two patterns. And then once you fix the root cause of the problem, which was the club face in these scenarios, then you can get rid of the compensations that your body was doing through impact. But you cannot change the way your body's moving until the club face is changed first, because at the end of the day, club face is king, and a lot of what we do is going to be dictated by that. I hope this helps.